The mission that should have been suicide. December 20th, 1943. The sky above Bremen was white with smoke and fire. The kind that meant someone's son wasn't coming home tonight. The crew of a B-17 flying fortress called Ye Olde Pub had been briefed that morning. Destroy a Focke-Wulf aircraft factory deep inside Germany. It sounded simple on paper. But everyone knew, these missions weren't about who was brave. They were about who got lucky. Second Lieutenant Charlie Brown, just 21 years old and on his first combat mission, climbed into the pilot's seat. His crew were all young, faces that still looked more like high school yearbook photos than soldiers. Yet when the order came, they took off like veterans. Crossing into enemy territory, flak guns opened up. Black bursts tore the sky apart. Each explosion rocked the fortress like a hammer hitting steel. One by one, engines sputtered, holes opened in the fuselage, and oxygen masks froze from the cold. Still, they pressed on, dropped their bombs, hit their target, and paid the price. The formation broke apart. Ye Olde Pub was left alone, limping home, bleeding fuel and smoke. Moments later, a swarm of German fighters appeared. They came in fast, ruthless, slashing through the sky like blades, tracers stitched across the wings, glass shattered, metal screamed, the tail gunner was hit. Then the top turret. The nose was shredded, and Brown himself took shrapnel to the shoulder. Inside it was chaos. No intercom, no heat, no control. But somehow, Ye Olde Pub stayed in the air, a dying machine flown by men too stubborn to quit. When the last German plane broke off, the bomber was barely holding together. It was alone now, deep over Germany, engines coughing, crew bleeding, altitude dropping. Charlie Brown knew the odds. He whispered to himself, "Just get them home." And that's when another speck appeared on the horizon. At first they thought it was an angel. Then they realized it was another enemy fighter. The German ace. The man in the Messerschmitt was Franz Stigler, a Luftwaffe pilot with more than 20 kills. He was no rookie, no idealist. He'd fought over North Africa, survived dogfights that most never walked away from. But he was also raised by his father with one rule: you shoot at a machine, not at a man who can't fight back. When he spotted the B-17 below him, he saw an easy kill. It was flying low, barely 1,000 feet off the ground, trailing black smoke. The tail gun was gone, the rear glass blown out. One engine was dead, another sputtering. The plane looked like it had been through hell and somehow refused to die. Stigler lined up behind it, finger on the trigger. Through his gun sight, he could see the crew, men slumped over, one tending to another's wounds, another desperately trying to control the shattered plane. He hesitated. Something didn't feel right. He moved closer, just a few meters away now, close enough to see faces through the glass. The tail section was soaked in blood. He saw a man staring back at him, terrified, but still gripping his machine gun with frozen hands. Stigler eased off the trigger. He couldn't do it. Instead of attacking, he pulled alongside the bomber, wingtip to wingtip. Inside, the Americans couldn't believe it. They expected cannon fire, but instead the German was just flying there, watching. Brown turned to his co-pilot. "He's toying with us," he said. But then something incredible happened. Stigler motioned with his hand, signaling for them to turn toward the North Sea, toward home. The enemy wasn't here to kill them. He was here to guide them out. The escort through hell. For a few seconds, time froze. The German fighter, sleek, deadly, painted with the black cross, floated beside the shattered B-17 like a ghost. Inside, Charlie Brown and his crew just stared, not knowing whether to shoot or pray. The B-17 was dying. One propeller hung still. The fuselage was torn open, and frost covered the metal like ash. The men inside were pale, their eyes empty. They'd lost almost everything. But somehow the plane was still in the air. Then the unthinkable happened. The German pilot nodded, not mockingly, not with arrogance, but with respect. He pointed ahead toward the coastline. The crew didn't understand at first. Brown's mind was fogged with pain and exhaustion. Why wasn't the German firing? Was it a trap? But Stigler stayed there, steady, protecting them. Each time a German flak battery saw the crippled bomber and prepared to fire, they hesitated. Because right beside it, unmistakably, was one of their own. Down below, anti-aircraft crews didn't dare pull the trigger. They saw a Luftwaffe ace escorting a wounded enemy, and assumed there must be orders they didn't know about. For the next 15 minutes, the two aircraft flew side by side, enemies sharing the same sky, bound by something neither army could teach. The sun broke through the clouds, lighting up the silver bomber and the gray fighter wingtip to wingtip. Inside the B-17, the crew slowly realized what was happening. The German wasn't attacking, he was saving them. Brown, shaking, raised his hand from the cockpit. He couldn't speak over the wind, but he mouthed one word: "Thanks." Stigler nodded again, eyes fixed forward. He knew what this meant: disobeying orders, risking his life, his honor, maybe even execution. But he didn't care, because war had taken enough from both sides already. The moment he aimed and hesitated. When the coastline finally appeared, a thin silver line beyond the haze, Stigler knew his part of the journey was over. If he crossed into open water, German radar would see his transponder and label him a traitor. He throttled back, flying even closer. He could see Charlie Brown through the cracked glass, young, bloody, trembling. Stigler thought of his own brother, who had died earlier in the war. He thought of all the men he'd shot down, and how this boy could easily have been one of them. He leveled his plane, one last time, directly beside the bomber's cockpit. Then he saluted, a slow, respectful motion. Not as an enemy, but as a soldier to another soldier. Brown stared, stunned. He couldn't move, couldn't even process it. The German fighter rolled its wings, then peeled away, banking sharply to the right and vanishing back into the clouds. The bomber continued on its lonely path toward England. Inside Ye Olde Pub, the silence was heavier than gunfire. Nobody spoke. Nobody could. They just sat there, 11 men who had just witnessed something they'd never forget. When they finally landed back in England, the plane barely held together. One engine failed on the runway. Medics rushed in, pulling out the wounded crew. When Charlie Brown told his superior officer what had happened, about the German pilot who had escorted them home, nobody believed him. It sounded impossible, ridiculous. But deep down, he knew what he saw. In a sky filled with hate, he had met a man who refused to surrender his humanity. The return home nobody believed. When Ye Olde Pub touched down in England, the runway went silent. Ground crews froze as the wrecked bomber rolled to a stop, holes big enough to crawl through, engines torn open, bullet marks from nose to tail. It looked like something that shouldn't exist anymore. And yet, it had made it back. The medics rushed in. Inside, men were half-conscious, covered in frost and blood. Charlie Brown stumbled out last, his flight suit stiff from dried fuel and ice. He barely made it 10 steps before collapsing. When he woke up hours later, an officer was standing over him. "Lieutenant," he said, "what the hell happened up there?" Brown told them everything, about Bremen, the flak, the fighters and the one German pilot who didn't finish them off. He explained how the Messerschmitt had flown beside them, how it had guided them out to the sea instead of firing. He even mentioned the salute, the kind of detail no one would make up. But the officer's expression hardened. "You're telling me a German protected you?" "Yes, sir. That's impossible. Either you're mistaken, or you imagined it." The report was filed, but no one took it seriously. The official version said the bomber somehow escaped through bad weather. No mention of the fighter. No mention of mercy. Still, Brown couldn't shake the memory. He saw the German's face every night, calm, focused, human. The look of a man who had decided that one act of kindness was worth more than another medal. Years went by. The war ended. Charlie Brown went home, married, built a quiet life in Miami. But the story stayed with him. It wasn't about survival anymore. It was about the question that haunted him. Who was that man? The pilot who could have killed him, but didn't. And across the ocean, in a very different world, Franz Stigler carried that same memory too. He never spoke about it publicly, because if he had, he could have been court-martialed, even executed for aiding the enemy. But sometimes, when he looked at the sky, he thought of that crippled bomber limping home, and he smiled. Because he knew, for one brief moment, he had been the man he always wanted to be. Not a killer, but a protector. The search for the unknown pilot. 40 years passed. The war that once divided the world was now something you found in history books, not skies. Charlie Brown had grown old. The kind of man who spent quiet mornings with coffee and memories. But one memory still refused to fade. He couldn't forget that German pilot. That moment in the sky had defined everything that came after. His faith in people, his belief that even in hell, good men existed. And yet he never even knew the man's name. In 1986, now retired, Brown decided he couldn't leave this world without finding him. He wrote letters, dozens of them, to veteran organizations, war museums, aviation clubs in Germany. He described the encounter. A Messerschmitt Bf-109, the date, the location, and the act that had saved his crew. For years there was silence, until one day, a letter arrived from Canada. A man named Franz Stigler had read the description in a newsletter for German fighter pilots. He knew instantly it was him. He remembered that broken B-17, the faces inside, the salute. Everything. Stigler sat in his small home near Vancouver, the paper trembling in his hands. He finally had a name, Charlie Brown. He wrote back immediately. When Brown received the letter, his hands shook too. They exchanged stories, photos, and finally arranged to meet in person, not as enemies, but as two old men who had once shared the same sky, one as the hunter, one as the hunted. When they met in 1990, the room went silent. They looked at each other, decades older, gray-haired, but the recognition was instant. Brown stood, tears already in his eyes. "You were the one," he said. Stigler nodded softly. "I never wanted to kill you," he replied. In that moment, history was rewritten, not by nations, but by two men who chose humanity over hate. When enemies become brothers. After that meeting, the two men became inseparable. They called each other several times a week, spent holidays together, and told their story to schools, veterans, and journalists across the world. Not to glorify war, but to prove that compassion could survive even inside it. Stigler once said in an interview, "I could have shot them down, but I couldn't have lived with myself after. I didn't spare them for their sake. I spared them for mine." They called each other brother. When one was sick, the other flew across the continent to visit. When they spoke, it wasn't about battles or kills. It was about family, faith, and the strange gift of that December morning in 1943. Their bond lasted until the very end. Both men died in 2008, just months apart, as if they couldn't exist in this world without the other. At Franz Stigler's funeral, someone placed a framed photo of the two men together on top of the casket. Underneath it were just 4 words, "My brother, my friend." And so, in a war that turned men into monsters, these two proved something unshakable, that mercy is stronger than hatred, that courage isn't just about pulling a trigger, it's about knowing when not to, and that even in the darkest chapter of humanity, some souls still chose light.